My name is Major General Evelyn Carter, United States Marine Corps. And on the very day my father raised a glass to marry his new wife at the American Legion Hall in Charlottesville, he pointed straight at me, his voice carrying above the music. This girl is nothing but a bastard. The room erupted, then went dead silent. The Conway Twitty track cut off mid-lyric. Forks and knives froze on paper plates. The cheap sting of red wine and half-finished Budweiser suddenly turned acrid in the air. Someone tried to laugh it off, thinking he must be joking. But he wasn't. He pressed the words again, harder, as if stamping a seal. I stood behind a row of tables draped in plastic cloth, blotched with barbecue sauce, a paper cup of coffee in my hand. The liquid inside was thin, black, with a plastic burn that caught in my throat. Neon lights washed every face in a sickly shade. A few people looked up at me, then quickly dropped their eyes. Aunt Clara, the only one with the nerve to react, muttered, "Oh, Henry," before falling silent. My father turned, draped his arm over Amber, Linda's daughter from her first marriage. Tight pink dress, hair sprayed high, a smile curled like a pageant queen's. He lifted her chin, voice booming. "This is my real daughter. This is the one who truly carries the Carter name." No one defended me. No one tapped a glass in protest. Only a thick, suffocating silence hung in the room, heavier than the insult itself. I didn't shout. I didn't answer back. That has never been my way. I simply set the paper cup down on the bar, gave a small nod to the young bartender, and turned toward the door. And in that silence, I realized the real wound wasn't in my father's words. It was in the way every eye chose to look away. Outside, the metal door clanged shut behind me, sealing in the music and the laughter, leaving only a heavy void. The air hit different, sweltering and close, like a thick blanket pressed against my chest. The asphalt in the parking lot radiated heat, mixing with the sweet cut of fresh grass from the lawn next door. Cicadas screamed their endless chorus, a soundtrack no one could switch off. I leaned against a faded silver Chevy Malibu, its blistered paint reflecting the weak glow of the street lamps. The metal burned through my blouse. I closed my eyes. My breath carried the stench of gasoline and cigarette smoke drifting from the cluster of veterans near the door. They glanced at me, then turned away. People never know what to do when humiliation happens right in front of them. In my mind, the hall was still alive. My father, chest puffed, his grip tight on Amber's shoulder. Linda laughing loud, teeth flashing white under neon. Aunt Clara, with her head bowed, silenced by helplessness. And everyone else. All of them, pretending to be busy with paper plates and plastic cups. I'd heard bullets whistle past my head. I'd watched flag-draped coffins lower slowly to the bugle's call. But being cut off by your own blood in front of everyone, no blood, no bullets, left a scar of a different kind. It hurt sharper than steel. Leaning against that hot parking lot pavement, I heard my mother's voice again, Ruth's rasp from cigarette smoke and diner grease. "You can't pick every fight, Evelyn. But the fights you pick, you fight clean." I opened my eyes and looked at the trunk behind me. Inside, the blue dress sat still in its cloth bag, heavy, silent, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. The smell of burning asphalt snapped memory back to Texas in the late 70s. Our little duplex sighed every time wind moved across the fields. The ceiling fan rattled, doing nothing to cut the heat. In the kitchen, my mother would come home from a night shift at the roadside diner, her uniform smelling of grease, hair pinned in a hurry, hands reddened from washing dishes in scalding water. She'd set her cheap shoes by the door and rub at cracked heels. My father, Henry, was rarely home. When he was, he brought the scowl. I remember one dinner. He looked right at me and said, sharp as a blade, "You'll be no better than your mother." He meant it as shame. I kept it as a kind of certificate. My mother was the strongest person I'd ever known. At 13, I delivered newspapers at dawn. The icy dew made my hands bleed. Summers, I mowed lawns, raked leaves, anything that would earn $2. Friends saved for cassette tapes or BMX bikes. I stuffed every spare bill into a glass jar and dreamed of leaving town on a ride that never came back. Once I asked my mother why she never argued with my father, even when he was plainly wrong. Ruth put her hand on my shoulder, voice rough but resolute. "Evelyn, you can't fight every battle. But the battles you choose, you fight clean." Standing in that parking lot tonight, her words rang as sharp as they had then. They had followed me for years like an unspoken order, and I knew with a clarity that settled in my chest, this fight, I would not walk past it. At 14, I was up before dawn. The Texas streets still carried a veil of mist, my bike tires crunching over damp asphalt. The paper sack slung heavy across my shoulder, ink-stained bundles cutting cold lines into my fingers. I tossed papers from corner to corner, the smell of wet newsprint mixing with the night grass and the lingering gasoline from delivery trucks already on their routes. My mother was still at the diner then, pouring coffee for long-haul drivers, her voice hoarse but always polite. She'd come home only when the sun stood high, sleeves darkened with sweat, hair loose with the smell of grease and kitchen smoke. I remember her narrow shoulders, the way she pulled out her hairpin and gave me a tired smile, as if to say, "We're alive, so we keep moving." The blistering summers, I didn't have a new BMX or a radio like the other kids. I had a rattling lawnmower, blistered hands, and a glass jar tucked beneath my bed. Inside, crumpled dollar bills stacked slowly, proof of a silent promise that one day I'd get out of that town. Henry, my father, was there sometimes, gone most of the time. When he was home, he brought nothing but whiskey breath and scorn. When he wasn't, the house settled into silence, broken only by the scratch of my pencil across paper and the steady tick of the clock. I learned not to wait, not to depend, only to work and to keep quiet. Somewhere along the way, that habit hardened into instinct. Every paper delivered, every yard mowed, every dollar slipped into that jar taught me one truth. If I wanted to stand tall, I would have to lay the foundation myself. No one else would. That August, I boarded a bus out of Texas with one small suitcase, $50, and my mother's pocket Bible. Destination, Paris Island. The moment I stepped off, the heat from the sandfields rose up like a furnace, burning away every illusion. Drill instructors' shouts slammed into my ears, each command tearing through the air. "Move, recruit!" Faster. On the first day, my hands shook so badly I couldn't lace my boots. A DI shoved my face down against the rough concrete, his voice thunderous. "You think you belong here?" Grit mixed with sweat stung my mouth, but I swallowed it down. I didn't answer. I just tightened my laces and stood back up. Every morning began at 0400. Runs through heavy fog, boots waterlogged and dragging like lead. Midday drills under a sun that blistered skin, the air thick with sweat and ragged breathing. At night, I lay in the barracks, the smell of bleach and rusted iron around me. The ceiling fan rattling overhead, eyes wide open while my muscles screamed. I wasn't the fastest, I wasn't the strongest, but every time I felt ready to collapse, I saw my mother's face, her hands raw and swollen, her hoarse voice saying, "Fight clean, Evelyn." Those words became the rope that pulled me up after every fall. Many nights I stripped and reassembled my rifle until my hands bled. Many mornings I ran until my lungs felt torn open. Hour by hour, day by day, I learned to square my shoulders, lift my chin, and keep moving. And when training finally ended, I was no longer the Texas girl with a small suitcase. I was a Marine. Not because someone said I belonged, but because I hadn't quit. My 20s passed inside brick barracks, damp, gray, heavy with the smell of bleach. I was stationed in Okinawa. Summers there felt like wearing a second skin of humidity that never let go. Every night we drilled until near midnight, sweat dripping onto the cement floor, mosquitoes whining in our ears. The steel fan on the desk rattled uselessly, never enough wind. I sat writing letters for the younger Marines, shaky words to mothers in Iowa or new brides in Kentucky. No report ever recorded those moments, but I knew. Sometimes a letter was the only thing keeping a man from breaking. Then came Iraq. The desert stretched endless, heat so fierce the rifle barrels scorched our palms. Wind carried sand that whipped our faces, lodged between our teeth. I stood under skies like that, waiting for each report, each convoy to return. At night, I sat in canvas tents that shuddered in the wind. Flashlight beams spread across a map, writing condolence letters to families of those who didn't make it back. Every letter was a cut. Not for rank, not for promotion, but because I stared into the names of those who had placed their lives in my hands. I was never the loud commander. I didn't pound my chest or shout orders. I listened. I showed up. When a sergeant collapsed under the weight of losing a friend, I sat beside him, silent, until the tears ran out. When a private shook before his first patrol, I told him, "Keep your eyes on me. If I'm still standing, you'll stand too." I didn't climb fast, but step by step I built something that couldn't be faked. A reputation for steadiness, for not leaving anyone behind. And from the dust of Iraq, I learned the truth. Leadership isn't about issuing orders. It's about giving your Marines the certainty that they will never stand alone. Back at my father's wedding, when I stepped into the hall again, the music had shifted. No more Conway Twitty. Now it was a familiar country tune. The crowd had gathered around the center table, where Linda beamed, her arm looped proudly around Amber as if showing off a prize. My father, Henry, stood close beside them, his voice carrying loud enough for the whole room. "This is my real daughter." A Marine, stationed right at Quantico. Talented, disciplined, with a wide-open future. Relatives clapped. Someone even whistled. A voice rang out, "Way to go, Amber!" I looked at her face, cheeks flushed from wine, lipstick fading, but eyes lit up, as though she'd already stepped onto a victory podium. Linda squeezed her daughter's hand, so proud her voice trembled. "Not everyone gets chosen for Quantico. She's going to go far." I stood still, glass of water in my hand. No one looked my way. The middle-aged woman in a plain blue dress, quiet in the corner. They didn't know, or didn't care, that just a week earlier at my own desk in Quantico, I'd seen Amber Carter's name in a report. Not on a commendation list, on a disciplinary note. Inflated travel expenses, paperwork missing signatures. A small infraction, but enough to flag. I said nothing. Not out of fear, but because I knew truth doesn't need to be shouted across a wedding hall. I sipped the tasteless water, let it slide down my throat, and held my silence. The Corps had taught me that, to know when to speak and when to wait. Laughter swirled, toasts lifted high, all orbiting Amber. My father looked at her with that radiant gaze, the very one I had longed for my whole life and never once received. But I wasn't jealous. What I felt was clarity. He was willing to use her to erase me from our bloodline. I walked out of the hall again. The country music and loud laughter behind me slammed shut with the door, cut off like a wave hitting a sea wall. Outside, the parking lot was thick with heat, cicadas buzzing without pause. I leaned against the trunk of the faded Malibu. Under the sickly yellow glow of the lamp, the garment bag holding my blue dress uniform revealed its sharp folds. I laid my hand on it, the weight pressing back at me like a decade of service, every night march, every morning formation. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through the contacts. A familiar name appeared, Marcus Dean. We'd served together in Okinawa. He was retired now, but his voice still carried the weight of someone who knew what it meant to stand firm. I pressed call. A short ring, then he picked up. General Carter? Didn't expect to hear your voice at this hour. I exhaled, eyes fixed on the uniform bag. I'm at my father's wedding. In front of 100 people, he called me a bastard. Then he put his arm around Amber and said she was his real daughter.
The line went quiet for a few seconds. Then Marcus let out a dry sandpaper laugh. Henry hasn't changed, huh? But let me ask you, what are you thinking right now? My throat tightened. In the trunk, I've got my blue dress. 2 stars, rows of ribbons. Part of me wants to put it on, walk back in, let them see the truth. But another part worries that would just be petty. Marcus didn't hesitate. Evelyn, you paid for every stitch on that uniform. Wearing it isn't revenge, it's truth. And standing in truth has never been petty. I closed my eyes. The cicadas droned, pulling their sound into a thin, steady wire. Inside me, my mother's words and Marcus's voice wove together. Not loud, not dirty, just clean. I opened the trunk. The gray garment bag lay there, still, under the parking lot light. The zipper's metal gleamed like a sharp cut. I ran my hand down the coarse fabric, the heat rising into my palm.
The blue dress weighed more than any clothing I had ever worn. Not just in fabric, but in the years it carried. I remembered a rainy night in Okinawa, boots slapping through mud. I remembered the searing heat of Iraq, the rifle barrel burning my hands. I remembered the condolence letters I signed by flashlight, each word etched into my chest. Every thread of this uniform had soaked in sweat, tears, even blood. It wasn't party attire. It was a mirror of a life lived. The muffled music seeped out from the hall. I could picture my father lifting his glass, Linda's strained smile, Amber basking in admiring eyes. They could tell whatever story they wanted, but the truth of my life lay here, inside this bag. I touched the pinned silver stars. Cold. The metal glinted back, reminding me, these weren't given. I climbed every rung myself, slow, patient, without a hand to steady me. And now those 2 stars sat heavy on my chest like stones. Yet they were the one piece of evidence no one, not even Henry, could erase. I straightened my spine. The parking lot heat no longer smothered me. In the silence, I knew. It was time to walk back into that hall. not as a daughter seeking his approval, but as the woman I had become. I pulled the zipper down. The rasp of metal broke the silence of the parking lot, like the first note of an overture. The smell of wool and pressed fabric rose up, taking me back to every locker where I had once hung this uniform before an inspection. I slid into the crisp white shirt, the buttons pulling tight across my chest, cool as morning air against my skin. Next came the dark blue coat, heavy fabric, stiff shoulders, wrapping me in its weight. I straightened my spine. The sensation was familiar, discipline settling in, the years of not quitting pressing down, but holding me upright. I fastened each gold button, one by one, each click like a heartbeat, solid, unshakable. From a small velvet case, I lifted the ribbons and medals. Metal caught the yellow lamplight, sharp and bright. I pinned them to my chest, each cold touch like a sting, each one carrying a story no one in that hall would ever fully know, but one I could never forget. The faces, the sacrifices. Finally, the shoes. Black leather polished to glass. When I slid my feet in, the creak of leather was so familiar my back stiffened on its own. I caught my reflection in the Malibu's side mirror. Not the middle-aged woman standing small in the corner of a wedding reception, hands trembling around a paper cup of weak coffee. The figure staring back was Major General Evelyn Carter, United States Marine Corps. I placed the cover on my head, adjusted the brim with a fingertip, and drew in a long breath. No more asphalt fumes, no stale cigarette smoke, only the grounded scent of the uniform itself, wool and starch, steady and unyielding. I closed my eyes, heard my mother's voice, heard Marcus's steady words. Fight clean. Wearing it isn't petty, it's the truth. When I opened them, I knew. I was ready. I pushed the door open. A blast of air conditioning swept out, erasing the suffocating heat of the parking lot. The country music cut off mid-verse, like someone had yanked a plug. I stepped inside, heels striking the polished tile in hard, deliberate beats, each one cracked through the silence, pulling every eye toward me. Neon light spilled down, catching on the 2 silver stars set against dark blue cloth. For a long moment, no one breathed. I saw Aunt Clara lift a hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming. At the back, a cluster of old veterans rose to their feet, spines snapping straight, trembling hands lifting in salute. Henry froze in the middle of the crowd. The champagne glass in his grip shook, the liquid quivering at the rim. Linda stiffened, her practiced smile locked in place. Amber, still basking in praise, turned to look. Her eyes landed on the ribbons, then climbed to the 2 stars. Her lips parted, red wine clinging to the corner of her mouth. Oh my God, she's my general. The words cut sharper than the silence, hanging higher than the pounding in the room's chest. No one moved. No one dared break it. I didn't speak. I walked, slow, measured, each step ringing out like a drumbeat. People shifted aside, forming a path. I moved through the haze of cheap perfume, barbecue smoke, stale beer. All of it blurred into nothing but the echo of my boots and the gleam of the stars on my shoulders. At the head table, Henry swallowed hard, his face locked tight, eyes fixed on me. I didn't need to meet them. I knew, before everyone, he had seen the truth he could no longer bury. I stopped just in front of the table. The stars threw back the light, mirrored in every gaze watching. I raised the glass of water in my hand, my voice steady, low, firm, each word clear. I came tonight only to wish my father happiness. I did not come to be shamed. I don't need to argue. I don't need applause. I am who I am, and I have worked my entire life to stand here as that person. The room went still. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to pause. I lowered the glass, letting my eyes sweep slowly across the faces. No protest, no laughter, only silence, heavy as stone. Then Aunt Clara began to clap. Once, twice. The sound cracked open the room. A chair scraped, then another. More hands joined, until applause spread like a tide. From the corner, an old veteran in a frayed cap stood and raised his hand in a perfect salute. Others followed. The clapping swelled, wave after wave. Amber staggered back a step, her face draining, her glass trembling. Linda bit her lip, straining to hold a smile. Henry remained rigid, eyes sharp but faltering. He had spent a lifetime defining me with his gaze. Tonight, that power was gone. I didn't linger. I set the glass down, gave a small nod, and turned. The applause followed me, echoing in the hall, but I didn't take it as victory. I walked away because the truth had already been laid in that room, undeniable. Outside, the cicadas screamed again, thick and relentless. I drew a long breath, filling my lungs with the scent of grass and asphalt, and in the quiet of my chest, only one phrase remained. My mother's voice carried across the years. Fight clean. And tonight, I had. I rented a cheap room off the highway. The paint on the wooden door peeled, the lock hung loose, and the air smelled of bleach and old smoke. The mattress was stiff, springs squeaking when I eased back into it. I stayed in my uniform. I didn't have the strength to take it off. Streetlight bled through the thin curtains, casting a wavering strip of yellow across a stained ceiling. My phone buzzed. A voicemail. From Henry Carter. I sat up, my chest heavy. My fingers trembled a little as I pressed play. His voice came through, not the booming tone from the hall, but hoarse, broken into ragged pieces. Evelyn. I went too far. I shouldn't have said that. I don't know how to fix it, but I'm sorry. The line went dead. No goodbye, no plan to meet, just a stretch of empty space, the same emptiness he'd left behind his whole life. I set the phone down on the rickety table and sat very still. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. After all these years, I'd learned not to wait for perfect atonement. I breathed out slowly, long and steady, letting that late apology drift away like the night wind sweeping across the parking lot. Outside, rigs thundered down the highway, rattling the thin window. I lay back, eyes on the rough ceiling, my mother's voice steady in my head. Pick your fights clean. Tonight I had chosen, and tonight I had done it. The next morning I returned to Quantico. The office still carried the scent of paper and stale coffee. Sunlight streamed across a stack of files piled higher than the cup in my hand. On top, a familiar name, Amber Carter. I opened the file. The words were clear. Inflated travel expenses, missing signatures. Not career-ending, but enough to warrant a warning. I read line by line, steady, untouched by the echoes of the night before. My pen drew a clean line, my signature precise. No favoritism, no extra weight, only fairness. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where my mother rested beneath the old oak trees. The grass was deep green, dotted with small flags that rustled in the breeze. I stood before the stone etched with Ruth Carter, hands clasped behind my back. my shadow stretching long across the lawn. I spoke softly, almost to myself. Mama, I've kept it clean. There was no reply, only the sound of wind carrying the smell of damp earth and jasmine from the corner of the cemetery. I closed my eyes, breathing it in, and for a moment I felt her hands on my shoulders again, gentle but firm, the way they had always been. I stayed until the sun tilted low, painting the stone with gold before turning away. The path out was quiet, leaves crunching under my boots, and inside me, one truth remained sharp. Victory doesn't live in applause or praise. It lives in refusing to betray yourself. The change of command ceremony came on a crisp Virginia morning. White folding chairs lined the parade ground, the American flag snapping in the wind, the military band poised to play. I stood at the podium, uniform pressed, medals aligned, 2 silver stars gleaming in the sunlight. The ceremony followed tradition, the flag salute, the music rising, the passing of command from one unit to the next. I kept my remarks short, without flourish, just thanks, and a reminder about steadiness and discipline. The young Marines in the rows below watched closely, and I knew what they needed wasn't a speech, but the sight of someone steady. As the ceremony drew to a close, I stepped down to shake the hands of families in the crowd. And then I saw him, Henry. He stood alone in a loose suit, tie askew, his face more gaunt than I remembered. No Linda, no Amber, just him, with his hands buried in his pockets like any ordinary man waiting his turn. When I reached him, he pulled his hand free and extended it, under the eyes of everyone present. His voice was hoarse, unsteady but clear. "This is my daughter. Major General Evelyn Carter." No more bastard, no more denial. Just 2 words, my daughter, spoken aloud, anchored in front of hundreds. Words heavier than any insult, but this time placed where they belonged. I took his hand, gripped it firmly, and answered only, "Thank you." Nearby, Aunt Clara broke into tears, shoulders trembling as she whispered, "It's time, Henry. It's time." I didn't need an embrace. I didn't need a grand reconciliation. I only needed that single public acknowledgement, and I had it. That afternoon, as my car rolled away from base, the window down, the wind carried in the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. I thought of it all, the shame, the silence, the uniform, and the moment my father chose to correct his words. I realized then, honor doesn't need a crowd to exist, but sometimes the crowd needs to witness honor, so they'll remember it when it's their turn to stand firm. I came to understand one thing, after all the years and after that night. Other people's silence will never be allowed to define me. The heaviest burden isn't the insult itself. It's when we let it cling to us. What has kept me standing isn't the medals or the rank, but the choice I made each time. If I entered a fight, I would fight it clean. If you've listened this far, maybe you too carry scars from someone's words, sentences that made you feel small, pushed aside. Don't let them stick to you. Don't let them decide your worth. Stand in the truth of who you are, clean, steady. And if this story has touched you, please share it, because somewhere out there, someone needs to know they are worth far more than the cruel words once thrown at them.